There are few events that shake a man or woman to their core like an impending air disaster. Despite being the safest means of travel by far, there is always this eerie feeling of, what if I'm the unlucky one, anytime one steps on a plane? For most people, this fear is unrealized, but for the unlucky few, the fear manifests into a living nightmare. The hair follicles rise, and the eyes dilate, while one looks around for escape, as there is a crescendo of chaos in the cabin and cockpit alike. These are some of the craziest air disasters videos of all time. Cathay Pacific flight engine failure. On the 13th of April 2010, 309 passengers and 13 crew members were on board from Indonesia to Hong Kong when the unthinkable happened. 30 minutes after takeoff, while 12,000 meters above sea level, the crew received a strange error message, referring to a fault in one of the two engines. The crew contacted maintenance control to relay the error message and discuss the fluctuations, but the flight was decided to be safe, as other relevant engine parameters were normal. The inevitable was temporarily delayed. Strike one. Almost 2 hours after departure, the same message reappeared on the screen. Maintenance control was contacted again to review the issue. With all the other engine parameters being normal, continuing on to Hong Kong was again deemed safe. Strike two. After another 2 hours elapsed, the aircraft was on descent to Hong Kong when, this time there was double trouble, the screen displayed two error messages. The second message signified a compressor stall in the second engine, a potentially serious engine problem. The flight crew responded by moving the second engine's thrust lever to the idle position. To compensate for the stalled second engine, the crew set the first engine to maximum continuous thrust. Following these actions, the crew contacted Hong Kong Air Traffic Control, requesting the shortest possible route to the airport and priority landing. A few minutes later, the aircraft was in descent and approaching an altitude of 2,438 meters when the crew's worst possible fear was realized in the form of 3 words: engine 1 stall. Mayday was immediately declared by the crew. The aircraft's only functional engine also suffered a compressor stall, and if you remember, it had already been previously set to maximum continuous thrust. The engine's rotational fan speed slowly spooled up to about 74%, and there was an immediate error message of overspeeding. As the flight approached the airport, the crew found that the movement of the thrust levers failed to reduce thrust below 74%. While speeding excessively with this excess speed, the crew still had to plan for an emergency landing. 11 minutes after declaring the Mayday, the aircraft touched down hard at a speed of 426 kilometers per hour, 176 kilometers per hour, over the normal touchdown speed for that aircraft. The plane hit the concrete and bounced, briefly becoming airborne again until it slammed down hard, while causing the left engine to scrape against the runway surface. 5 of the aircraft's 8 main wheel tires deflated. Smoke and flames emanated from the landing gear, and the captain ordered an emergency evacuation, during which 57 passengers were injured, of whom 10 were transported to the hospital. Asiana Airlines Flight 214, 291 passengers and 16 crew members were on a scheduled flight across the Pacific from Seoul, South Korea to San Francisco, USA. After the overnight flight, they were prepared to land early in the morning of July 6, 2013. Almost half of the passengers were Chinese citizens, with about 70 students and teachers traveling to the United States for summer camp. 49-year-old Captain Lee Jong-min was in the cockpit, as both an instructor captain and pilot in command, which was his first flight as an instructor. He had about 3,220 hours of flying experience in a Boeing 777. 45-year-old Captain Lee Kang-kook was receiving his initial operating experience training and was halfway through Asiana's IOE requirements. He had just about 43 hours of flying experience in a 777. Right from the bat, the flying experience of both captains seemed a bit deficient, and it was cited as one of the contributory factors for the crash by the United States National Transportation Safety Board. The other major contributory factor was the unavailable complex flight control systems, specifically the Instrument Landing System's vertical guidance. The guidance system had been taken out of service a month prior, and a notice to air missions to that effect had been issued. The flight was largely uneventful until it was time to land. The flight was cleared for a visual approach to land, and the crew was told to maintain a speed of 330 kilometers per hour until the aircraft was 9.3 kilometers from the runway. The problem had started just about 82 seconds before the eventual impact. Analysis showed that the plane's approach was too slow and too low, and multiple passengers vividly recall the plane's bizarre proximity to the water on its final approach to land, which caused water to thrust upward as the engines were spooling up in the final moments before impact. The plane eventually crashed short of the runway threshold. The landing gear and then the tail struck the seawall that projects into San Francisco Bay. The tail section as well as the left engine separated from the aircraft. The fuselage and wings rotated counterclockwise approximately 330 degrees as the plane slid westward. After a moment, a dark haze of smoke rose from the wreckage. Of the 307 people on board, 3 died, and another 187 were injured, 49 of them critically. It was the first fatal crash of a Boeing 777 since the aircraft entered service in 1995. Emery Worldwide Flight 17. It's February of 2000, and 43-year-old Captain Kevin Stables is the pilot for Emery Worldwide Flight 17. It's a domestic freight flight that is flying from Reno to Dayton. It should be just another routine takeoff, but all of a sudden, they realize that there's a problem. The airplane rotated when it went off the runway. The staff immediately know that they need to go back to the airport and get things under control. The pilot declared an emergency and let the traffic controller know that this was a serious situation and that they had a problem. They couldn't get the plane to balance, and it continued to climb and then dip repeatedly. They needed to get back down to the ground safely and as soon as possible. The pilot thought he could pull it off, but while he attempted to land, part of the plane made contact with a 2-story building, causing them to crash into a salvage yard. All 3 crew members were killed in the accident. China Air Flight 120 runway explosion. China Airlines Flight 120 prepares to make a standard landing when everything goes wrong. It's a clean landing with no issues. The engine is off and they are parked. But all of a sudden, a radio call alerts the pilot and the rest of the staff that the plane is on fire. They manage to get the plane safely landed, but the flight attendants were having trouble getting the passengers to calm down. Everyone is desperate to get off the plane as soon as possible. They manage to evacuate the plane of all the passengers, but some staff members remain on board. They know they are running out of time. Every second that ticks by could possibly be bringing them closer and closer to the plane exploding. And sure enough, it does. Using the emergency escape rope that's designed into 737 cockpits, the pilots were the last to exit the aircraft. In fact, you can see that the impact of the explosion was felt by a pilot while struggling out the tiny window, causing him to take a daring leap onto the ground, thankfully without injuries. It was a remarkable save that quite easily could have ended very tragically. Rouge Learjet goes down.
We have a developing story, as you may have heard. There is a civilian Learjet.
It's 1999, and air traffic control was aware that a Learjet had gone rogue, but they didn't know why. Several possibilities could be at play here. The jet may have experienced technical difficulties, malfunctioned, or even possibly been hijacked. The safety of everyone on board was now in jeopardy. They know the plane will eventually run out of fuel, likely somewhere over the Dakotas, but what if it hits something in the process? F-16 fighters were sent to track the aircraft, as it's important to ensure that wherever the plane lands, it doesn't hurt even more people. Some of the people on board were famous athletes, including golfer Payne Stewart and football player Robert Fraley. The jet unfortunately crashed into a hayfield in South Dakota. There were no survivors. It was later determined that the plane lost cabin pressure and nobody on board had access to oxygen. The pilot was unable to safely fly the plane. Nigeria Airways, Flight 2120, catches fire. Mid-flight, on July 11th of 1991, Nigeria Airways, Flight 2120, was scheduled to fly from Jeddah in Saudi Arabia to Sokoto, Nigeria. They had no more than taken off from the airport when the plane suddenly burst into flames. Smoke is filling the cabin, and all the equipment is quickly failing. The flight crew needs to do something fast. Their passengers are understandably in a panic and are aware that something is terribly wrong. They need to get back to the Jeddah airport as fast as possible, but the pilot has lost hydraulics, which means he can't steer the plane. At this point, the passengers are struggling to breathe. What's even crazy is that the fire spread through the cabin floor, consuming whatever was in its path. Some passengers had fallen out of the airplane entirely, while others were most likely passed out from the lack of oxygen. It was complete pandemonium. The pilot declared an emergency and alerted the traffic controller. With all control of the landing gear lost, the plane would explode upon impact with the ground. All remaining passengers and crew members were sadly killed instantly. It was a major tragedy. Concorde Flight 4590 Air France Flight 4590 was an international charter flight scheduled to go from Paris to New York. It was carrying 109 people, including the flight staff, but just shortly after takeoff, the flight team realized that they had a major problem. There was debris on the runway that they had not anticipated the plane would run over. This caused one of the plane's tires to explode and send up tire fragments flying everywhere. All the while, the wheel that had lost a tire continued to spin at a dangerously fast rate. It ended up colliding with the tire debris, sending it flying into the underside of the plane, causing significant damage to the landing gear. But that's not the worst of it. The damage caused the fuel tank to rupture. quickly causing the fuel to start running out. The fuel ignited, causing further significant damage to the plane, and even though the plane had managed to take off, they still needed to quench the fire. But how? This was an unforeseen situation for which the pilot could not have prepared or trained. It's not something he would ever expect to happen, and now, all of a sudden, he was in a position to determine the safety of all of his passengers and crew. Unfortunately, nothing could be done, and the plane would eventually crash into an airport hotel. Everyone on the plane was killed, including 4 employees at the hotel, and several others were injured. Finnair crashing into Miami. It was August 7th of 1997, and Finnair Flight 101, which was a cargo flight, was scheduled to fly from Miami International Airport to Las Americas Airport. 4 people were on the plane, including a security guard, and it was expected to be a routine flight. However, it would turn out to be anything but. They would run into a problem quickly. Not long after the plane took off, the plane pitched up quickly into a stall, recovered briefly from the stall, and stalled again, causing the pilot to lose control. The air traffic controller watched in horror as he saw that the pilot was clearly having some serious problems and flying too low to the ground. Nothing could be done as the plane came hurtling toward the heart of Miami at extreme speeds. Everyone in the vicinity and those on the plane were clearly in extreme danger. The plane would ultimately crash, killing everyone on board as well as a man whom the plane struck in a nearby parking lot. As is proven in these stories, all it takes is a second for things to go from normal to tragically terrible when it comes to flying on a plane. What may have started out as just another normal day in the sky can literally come down to a matter of life or death in just a blink of an eye. We hope you enjoyed this video. Check out some of the other jaw-dropping videos on your screen.